My name is Matthew. I am 15 and a crossdresser. I have an older sister, Joyce, by 2 years, which should tell you why I crossdress. Joyce knows, but neither of my parents know I crossdress, at least I don't think they do. It was supposed to be one of those weekends when I had the entire house to myself as Carol, my name when dressing up. My sister, Joyce, had gotten a new dress a few weeks ago that I was dying to wear, but we had a pact. I could wear whatever I wanted to of hers, but not before she wore it. She wore the dress in question last week when she went out with her boyfriend, so now it would be my turn. Dad was away on maneuvers with his Army Reserve unit, and Mom and Joyce were going to spend the weekend doing girly stuff and would be gone until late Sunday evening. This was Friday afternoon. In the afternoon, I wore one of my favorite outfits, her school uniform. We went to a private school and had to wear uniforms. The girls had to wear those plaid uniforms you see all the time, and the boys wore black pants and a white shirt. I figured I would get into the dress about 7 and pretend that I was out on a date with an imaginary guy. By 7:30 I was all dressed in panties, pantyhose, a lace bra and padding, the dress, red with spaghetti straps and a square-cut neck. The other part was a short black velvet cape. There was a black velvet rope tie belt for my waist, and the hem was just about knee length. Of course I wore light pink pantyhose and beige-colored high heels. I spent a lot of time doing my makeup and hair and was ready to be Carol for as long as possible, maybe 2 days, almost. I had to be back to me late Sunday afternoon before anyone came back home. I kept all the lights off and the drapes drawn for privacy so no one would see the lights on and decide to stop by for a visit. About 8:30 when one movie went off the TV and another was getting ready to go on, I thought I might get a soda from the frig. As soon as I entered the dark kitchen I sensed that something was wrong. The outside door was open slightly and one of the window panes was broken. I was immediately grabbed from behind with one hand covering my mouth and an arm around my waist. I was scared shitless. All I could think of was what was going to happen to me if whoever it was behind me found out I was a guy. I heard him tell me that if I promised not to scream or make any noise he would remove his hand from my mouth. I nodded my head and he removed his hand but kept one arm around my waist. He slowly turned me around and I got a good look at him. I knew him. He was a senior and a stud. He was always with a bunch of senior girls and most of them were cheerleaders. He was also the captain of the football team, and girls, seniors and juniors were always drooling over him. What the hell was he doing here, robbing my house? Oh, his name was Rocky. He led me back to the living room, the brightest lit room in the house because of the TV and side lamp. He had moved his grip from my waist to my left arm and took a good look at me. "What's a pretty thing like you doing home alone on a Friday night?" I said the first thing that came to mind. My boyfriend stood me up. "He must be a fool. A girl as pretty as you should not be alone on a Friday night, or any night for that matter," he replied. Does he really think I'm pretty? I thought. I took that as a compliment. Then he started shoving me into the living room and told me to show him to the bedrooms. I first led him to my parents' room and showed him where they kept all their jewelry. I figured the best thing I could do was to cooperate, and maybe he would just take stuff and leave. The last thing I wanted was for him to find out I was a guy. He pulled a cloth bag from one of his pockets and started filling it with rings, watches and bracelets and just about everything they had. Then I led him to my sister's room, which I told him was mine, and showed him where she kept her jewelry. He didn't take all her stuff. He said a pretty girl needs lots of jewelry. There, he said it again. He said I was pretty. I could feel myself beginning to blush. He put his arm around my waist as I led him to my room, which I told him was my brother's room. I watched him go through all my stuff, mostly a few watches, and then he took my electronics, phone and other stuff like that, then, as an afterthought, led me by the hand to the other rooms and took all the electronics there. He took me back to the kitchen. "What's your name, gorgeous?" he asked me. "Carol." With a K, I replied, giving him the name my sister and I used when together as girls. A pretty name for a pretty girl. There he goes again, calling me pretty. I wish we could have met under different circumstances. I wouldn't mind having someone as hot as you as a girlfriend. I took that as a compliment again, the part about being pretty, not the part about being his girlfriend. In the kitchen, he pulled a chair into the middle of the room. "I'm sorry I have to do this, Carol, but I have to tie you up. Don't worry, I won't do it tight, wouldn't want to hurt you." He put his arms around me and kissed me on my lips. I was so shaken up by all that was happening I just let him. What the hell else could I do? He tied me up just like he said, not too tightly, and before leaving, kissed me again. It only took me a few minutes to get loose. A plan formed in my head. I had to change and call the cops and report the break-in, but didn't want to get Rocky into trouble, so I would tell the cops that I was at a movie and came home and saw that my house had been broken into. Yes, that would work. I hung my sister's dress in her closet after cleaning myself up and putting my own clothes back on, when I saw through a crack in the blinds that the Johnsons, the neighbors across the street, were sitting on their porch. I altered my plan just a bit. This would be better than me calling the cops. I left the house through the kitchen, went down the alley behind the houses to the street at the end, and turned onto my street. I casually walked to my house, being sure the Johnsons saw me. I waved to them before entering my house. I waited a few seconds and ran out and up to the Johnsons, yelling that my house had been broken into. I asked Mrs. Johnson to call the cops. She did, and Mr. Johnson went over to stand in front of my house to wait for them. Mrs. Johnson, Laura, asked if I was all right and asked if she should call my family. I never thought of that and gave her the number where they could be reached. The cops came and went through the house with me after making sure that there was no one there. They took a report and asked that my mother go to the station the next day for a full report on what was missing. Laura and Fred, Mr. Johnson, insisted I spend the night at their house. I had the weirdest dream that night, weird and scary. I dreamed that Rocky and I, Carol, were boyfriend and girlfriend. I woke up in a sweat. Mom and Joyce arrived home a little after noon. We went through the house checking to see what was missing and reported it to the police. Monday in school, I looked for Rocky at lunch and saw him at his usual table surrounded by the usual 4 or 5 hot girls and cheerleaders. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't recognize me, which wasn't strange because I am one of those guys who are invisible. Every school has a few. I watched him almost every day and dreamed of him every night for the next several weeks. I was so jealous of all the girls hanging around him. This went on for several weeks, until the day when Rocky's world came to an end. It was the most important game of the season. If we lost this game, we would be out of the playing. Rocky screwed up severely. He made some really amateur goofs that sent us to the bottom, and he paid for it. From that day, he was persona non grata as far as anyone in school was concerned. His hangers-on ignored him. He was alone at the pizza place with no one on his side except me, and I could not be seen with him. After about a week, I felt that I had to do something. I had no idea what, but I would do something. Then I knew what to do, which would be good for both him and me. I left school early one day and went home, where I got into one of my sister's school uniforms. I did not go the same school as she did, but I did from time to time wear her uniforms in private. I sauntered into the pizza place just as the crowd from school entered. I picked up a slice and soda, walked up the table Rocky was sitting at, alone, and sat down. I said hi and asked if he remembered me. It took him a few seconds, but from the look on his face I could tell he remembered. I told him not to get his panties in a bunch. I was not going to turn him in. I told him that that night was the most fun I had in years. Before I knew it, we were talking as if we were old friends. He asked if he could drive me home. Now I knew how all those cheerleaders felt being in the car with the hottest guy in school, and I was happy that I was one of those invisible kids that no one took a second look at. The very boldness of my actions, wearing a girl's uniform and being in public, worked on my side. He drove me home and parked in the alleyway behind the house and just talked for another half hour. I had to cut things short because I had to go in and get changed before anyone came home. Rocky asked if we could see each other again tomorrow, and naturally, I said yes. We met every day after that, and by the end of the second week he was holding my hand and had his arm around my shoulder as we talked in the car. I hoped things would go further and he would ask me out on a date, even though there was no way I could accept. It soon progressed to us making out in the alley. The very first time he kissed me I almost creamed my silk panties, and by the third or fourth time, I actually did. I kept thinking about the cheerleaders and how they screwed up, and I now had Rocky to myself. Eat your hearts out, you stupid bitches. Then one day everything worked out that I could go with my guy, that is, if he ever asked me, and I would do everything I could to make sure he did. My family was again going away for the weekend. I mentioned this to Rocky and he asked me if I would go out with him that very night. Of course I would. We kissed goodbye as usual. I hopped from the car and ran to my sister's room to pick out something for my very first date with a guy. I stripped naked in front of her huge walk-in closet. I picked out 2 dresses that I knew, from experience, I would look terrific in. I stood in front of the full-size mirror with a dress in each hand with my back to the door. "Hey babe, you sure look great from this angle," I heard from behind me. I dropped the dresses and turned quickly only to see Rocky standing in the doorway holding my book bag in his hand. I had forgotten it in his car in my haste and excitement. I guess he was just returning it to me. You should have seen the look on his face when he saw me facing him naked. The last thing I remember was seeing him racing across the room at me with his fist raised. "You damned pervert," was the last thing I heard or saw. I woke up just for a minute or two, just long enough to see that I was in a hospital room and my parents and sister were around my bed. I woke up a few more times, little knowing that each time it was several days later. By the time I stayed awake long enough to realize what was happening, it was almost a month, and exactly what was going on. My family told me that I had been beaten to a pulp. In descending order, from head to foot, I had a fractured skull and severe concussion, a shattered right cheekbone, in several places, a broken nose, several teeth were knocked out through my torn lips, my jaw was broken, my right collarbone was broken, 2 ribs, one on each side, were broken, shattered, and my penis and scrotum were mashed beyond repair. Plus many other bruises and contusions. It took almost 2 months to even start getting back on my feet and appear anywhere normal again, with some severe changes. A plastic surgeon fixed my right cheekbone, sort of. It was broken in so many pieces that he had to reconstruct it with medical plastic, and just to make it match my other one he had to do some work on it, the left cheekbone. My nose was no problem, but he did make it a bit smaller. It was a bit on the big side anyway. There was not much they could do with my broken ribs, so they removed them. More on that later. Now came the important thing, my mashed penis and scrotum could not be saved. Joyce was a big help to the plastic surgeon, and me in the long run. She, Joyce, told our parents of my dressing up and my desire to be a girl. I don't remember ever telling her that, but it was true. They talked to the surgeon. This made it easier on him, especially when it came to my penis and sack. He knew that it was beyond repair and told them that the best he could do was to reconstruct a tube to piss through. My desire to be a girl enabled him to construct a vagina, of sorts. He used this knowledge when he reconstructed my face and make it more feminine, and when removing my shattered ribs he did something to make it look like I had a narrow feminine waist. Let's cut to the chase. By the time I was released I was, for all intents and purposes, a girl. Of course, I needed breast implants and heavy-duty female hormones. My new name was Carol, the name I used when dressed with my lovely sister. All medical expenses were paid by Rocky's father, one of the richest men in the state, under the condition that I not press charges. Rocky was sent to live in Europe for a while. Would you believe that when the story came out that I had been beat up by person or persons unknown, almost 90% of the kids at school had no idea who I was before the beating? But after, they accepted me as Carol because they knew it was not my fault. After everything settled down and I was accepted as a girl, life was so much different for me, and so much better. Being popular is fun,